Hey, good day, everybody. Welcome to Deal Scout. On today's show, we're having another conversation with Mr. Andy. Andy, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Josh. It's always good to be here.
Yeah, man. So on our last interview, we talked about your story and how you built Transworld and helped grow it to what it is. And you help businesses, help people buy and sell businesses all day long. And you're just doing some incredible things. But we've had some conversations with some people that own businesses, and they I wanted to bring those questions to you and hear your thoughts on it. So how about we
that's
dive in?
great. That's great. I mean, people always are worried about selling their businesses and if they're doing it right. And I'll tell you, that's what we love entrepreneurs. First of all, we just love the whole process of watching people build a business. And we do want to make sure they get it right on the way out.
Yeah. So that's a fear that I'm hearing more and more when talking with people. So let's use some examples of, we're having conversations with a guy who has a construction company, right? He's built it pretty big. And, when it's coming time to sell, he's going, when's the right time to sell? What kind of taxes? What am I going to do with the rest of my life? I'm still kind of young. So kind of walk us through, in your experience after selling hundreds of businesses, thousands of businesses, like what are some common fears that people have when selling a business?
Well, you named a few of them right there, right? So first I'll tackle just the personal, right? So they have to be ready to sell. I had an interview yesterday with a psychologist, believe it or not. So, I'm not going to out psychology her on the phone of trying to convince her it's time to sell her business. And I said, this isn't about us. This is about your journey. And you have to be committed to selling your business because it's not going to be easy. There are going to have to be concessions made along the way. So you have to, in your mind, be ready to sell. And once you've made that decision, the problem is a lot of people, once they've made that decision, they're done, right? They're checking out. They've made the decision. They called the broker. As soon as they call the broker, in their head, business is sold. No. So it is a process. They have to be ready for that process. And so as far as, is it time for me to sell? That's part of your journey. And it's hard for entrepreneurs to make that decision because a lot of their personal kind of ego is tied up with being in their seat as the owner entrepreneur of a business. So they have to let that go. I just wound up selling my father-in-law's medical practice, and he's 83 years old, and he wanted to continue practicing. But he didn't want to run a business any longer because, running a business is tough, and there's employees, and especially in the medical world, there's Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements, and it's changing and negotiating with insurance companies. And he's just the guy who wants to, meet his patients. So part of deciding that you want to sell your business is what's going to happen afterwards, right? So he had a wish. His wish was, he continues to practice for as long as he wants in his office, in his specific office, and let somebody else run the business. We were able to find someone like that. We just, same thing with the psychology practice. One of the partners wants to transition, 75 years old. The other partner's willing to stay on, but very concerned about the leadership of their company wanting to stay on and continue. So they want to find the right partner. We just did the Mai Kai restaurant, famous, world-renowned Mai Kai restaurant. It was a historical landmark. Owners did not want to run the business anymore, but they wanted to see the Mai Kai. It had some damage to it from a storm last year. So they wanted to see it be reopened and continue on as the world famous Mai Kai. So we needed very specific buyers. So the original thought, number one, you have to decide you want to change your life. Number two is you want to kind of formulate what that change looks like. And so you can have a clear goal in your head. Do I want to stay on? Do I want to take my foot off the gas pedal and be able to work part-time? Or do I want another job in my company? The owner of Transworld sold me Transworld in 1997. He stayed on for a dozen years. His partner, his wife, left 6 months later, maybe a year later. She was done. She didn't want to work anymore. He wanted to do deals and didn't want to pay the bills and didn't want to hire the employees and didn't want to worry about technology anymore. So once somebody decides what their role moving forward is, then they have to decide, all right, what are the business obstacles or fears about moving forward? And, we could talk about that a little bit now.
Yeah. So really, really great. So there has to be this shift in mindset. It's not like just listing a real estate house, right? It's not like listing your house and, you pack up the house and you move out and then someone moves back in. It's a process from the transfer. What do you think is like the main sticking point of that mindset shift? Like, how do you know that one day someone's ready to sell? What do you look for as a broker?
It's funny. We often say to people, and one of my top brokers, Tom Jones, he says, can you imagine that person out of that seat of CEO entrepreneur in 12 months? I mean, that's our usual time period that we ask for when we are engaging a client. So give us 12 months, we'll sell your business. And if we don't think that they're ready enough, or, they're 45 years old, 35 years old, they're like, just put it up for sale and let's see what happens. That's not our client. Our client is someone that we feel that is going to need to move in 12 months. Again, another psychology practice that we were selling many years ago. The owner of the practice had moved to Charlotte and was still running her practice here in South Florida and commuting.
Oh, geez.
Now, and she had 2 young kids. Now, that was not going to work for her. We knew that, and she knew she had to sell, kicking and screaming all the way. Didn't want to really. She wanted to sell to the right buyer. Again, finding the right buyer. The other, example I can use on that is we had a gentleman, air conditioning company that made air conditioning filters that were reusable. You wash them down, you put them back in, right? Great company. And he had just had a lung removed, very sick guy. And we were talking to him and his wife, and he walks us around the factory. He has to stop halfway through, and he looks at us and he says, by the way, I'm not in a rush to sell this business. And his wife is behind him. He can't see her. His wife behind him gives us the big eye roll, kind of like this. And she grabs us before we left the meeting. We left them inside the office. She followed us out to the parking lot and she says, get me an offer by the end of the weekend and I'll get this thing sold for you guys. So, I mean, that's an extreme of someone ready to go. So it's hard. I mean, I have a client right now that is 66 years old, had a goal in his life to sell at 66, and now has a bunch of people in his life, accountant, attorneys, other friends telling him, why are you selling? It's going to be worth so much more in a couple of years. And, that's where we could get to I'd like to revisit your example of the construction company, because I think timing is very important. Yeah. And, so construction. Historically, construction in Florida has been very good business to be in, but sometimes extremely cyclical. We will go through, a economic downturn like we did in 2009 and 2010, where the construction world is just devastated. And, right now is a huge boom. And the housing crisis, it's not a crisis, but the housing is at short supply, and they can't build, they come up something out of the ground and it's being sold out immediately. Great time for your client who's talking about selling for selling. And we actually are selling a construction company for a couple $1 million right now. It's a friend of mine that I've known. Actually, it's a friend of my wife's that she's known since he was a kid. And he knows, he's been through several cycles of buying it and getting into development, getting his butt handed to him because he built at the wrong time or started projects out of the ground at the wrong time, and realizes that this is a really good time to sell and I should sell. And he's doing it, and he's only 54 years old, but realizes, hey, I need to cash this check, put my family in a good place, and then maybe I'll continue on later on.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to pay attention to, to the market and, the ups and downs. And when, it's always a good idea to sell when you're up, right? When things are hot, when they're booming, when there's high demand, it's probably not the best time to sell when the market's, super flat or down, like we've experienced in 2009, 10, 11. When someone goes, okay, I want to sell, then they start to move down this process. Okay, now I'm working out. How, for the people who go, I want to sell, how do they stay in the deal? Because they can't just turn the business off and then walk away like it's a vacant house. They still have to keep the foot on the gas. Like, what are some of the things psychologically, like the person has to stay in? How do you find that works out well?
They have to ignore us. I mean, they have to ignore the process. I mean, seriously, that's why they're hiring us, right?
Yeah.
So they're hiring advisors so they don't have to worry about the process. And if they get sucked into the process, which we've seen before, we've seen people try to handle their own deal. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a business broker and want to be hired. I've seen people do this. They get sucked into the deal, or even if they have an advisor like us, they get sucked into the deal and they start making decisions based on that they think they're going to sell. And what happens is, in a deal, and you know this, you've been involved in lots of deals, is the day before the closing, the bank all of a sudden calls everybody up and says, oh, by the way, can we have last month's P&L statement and balance sheet? And, the business owner's face goes white because they have taken their foot off the pedal. I've seen people stop pay-per-click ads. I've seen people fire salespeople. I've seen people not get necessary inventory to continue on. I've seen people close locations, all really silly things because they think they're going to sell at the end of the month. And what either happens is the deal dies, or there's a major haircut, renegotiation given at the end of the month. So you can't take your foot off the gas. So the best thing that the seller can do is continue to operate. And people call me up. I just had an advertising company I've been talking to for many years, good friend of mine, advising her on what I think the right time to sell is. And, she got some major clients this year. Things are really good. And she's thinking of going on the market. And she asked me, well, should I hire this person? And should I get a bigger office because I need it because of this new client? But I don't know if I should do that because I'm thinking of selling. And I'm like, you have to pretend like I'm not here. You have to run your business like it's never going to close. And I tell that to people the day before closing. They say, I really need to order inventory for next month. And I'm like, order inventory for next month because first of all, the buyer's going to need it. And maybe we'll check with the buyer first, but it may not close tomorrow. And we've had those kind of deals happen. We had an unfortunate incident for a drive-through restaurant where, there was an incident outside where someone got shot outside the restaurant, and boom. I mean, there's no sale. We were counting inventory on a jet ski, a jet ski dealership, and we were counting inventory, and somebody took an old machine or an old repair machine or drill press, I forget what it was, and they would check to see if it worked. So they plugged it in and they left it plugged in. Well, I guess it hadn't been plugged in so long, it started a fire, and the whole place burned to the ground. Millions of dollars worth of inventory, a complete disaster for us, the deal guys, a complete disaster for the buyer because they didn't wind up buying the business, a complete disaster for the bankers who didn't get a loan out, a complete win for the seller because they got all cash from the insurance company. So, so you got to run your business right up to the last day.
Yeah. So that, I mean, we should do chats, deals gone wild, right? Like the day before the closing, the business goes up in fire. Like who would have ever guessed? And you're like, oh crap, we put in all this work and we didn't get paid, right? That's
Yeah, I
crazy.
mean, we've seen, unfortunately, and just recently COVID, we've had a few deals be delayed. Thank God it was only delayed because either the seller or the buyer or the employees got COVID. And, I think one of our deals, 5 out of 7 employees come down with COVID right before the closing. And of course, the buyer doesn't want to buy if, something bad's going to happen. I mean, the good news was, so we waited a couple of weeks, everybody got better.
Yeah.
And even the buyer just going in there and getting trained, that was impossible. It was all hands on deck for the seller who had to run the business with the skeleton crew. So, it's just things like that happen. But, you have to run your business right up to the day of closing. So you do have to have a mindset of, I may not sell. Back to your example of a home. If you list your home for sale, especially in this market, you are probably 95% assured that your business, your home is going to sell. Even in a bad market, I think if you price it right, eventually a home will sell. That's not the case with a business. Businesses don't always sell. And that becomes, a difficulty for some businesses.
Yeah. With the fear of taxes, right? So I'm making this money every year, seller discretionary earnings. I'm cashing out some good things along the way. It comes time for sale. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to take this huge hit on taxes, right? What does that look like, and why is the fear real?
Well, listen, we all have to pay taxes. There's nothing more certain in life than death and taxes, right? So we have to pay taxes. It is a part of doing business. The government is your partner. Now, how much taxes do you have to pay? There are some ways to structure your business sale to avoid taxes, but let's just try to tackle it. Number one, if you're selling a business, small business, let's say under $1 million of EBITDA, you're going to get 2 to 3 years worth of earnings and maybe have a capital gains against that, which right now is about 20%. And we'll talk about capital gains in a minute. That's probably, a little better than that 2-3 years of earnings is probably almost 4 or 5 years, because those, if you earn those monies over the next 2 or 3 years, you're probably going to have to pay, 35, 40%. And you have the risk of getting through those next few years and making that kind of money, because people are like, well, I'll just stick around for 2 or 3 years and make that kind of money. And we always say, yep, stick around. Oh, but I don't want to because, I'm having a divorce, or I want to retire, or we're moving. And I'm like, okay, so then we have to sell and we have to deal with the taxes. So taxes are real. Now let's talk about capital gains, because currently everybody's freaking out. Again, one of my clients, same client I talked about earlier, 66 years old, and his accountant says, do not sell now because it's going to be 40% and it's going to be retroactive. Well, I just did a podcast that's coming up, and it's my predictions for 2022. And one of my predictions is capital gains will absolutely not be 40%. Now, why are they talking about 40%? Because they want to get it from 20 to maybe 25. As we see, the government is not very good at getting anything done. So the idea that they're going to double capital gains in a year that we're having interim financials, interim elections, is very, very unlikely, extremely unlikely. And in the historic world of tax implementation, there has been maybe one, because I got corrected. I said there's never been a tax rate, a tax increase where they retroactively applied it. And I was corrected. There has been. All right. But so infrequently. and not something that's this quote unquote that devastating. So if you do want to sell, I would even say if capital gains go up, certainly not they're certainly not going to apply to 2021. I don't even think they're going to apply it to 2022. You may have an issue in 2023. We'll see. But again, taxes should not be the reason you're selling. And even, making money, unless you're in that business, which we've talked about before, people who love deals, turning over deals, building companies, 98% of the people we deal with are not those people. They're not selling because they're trying to cash in. They're selling for a life reason.
Yeah.
And when that life reason comes along, it's time to go. And, I think there's some, I think there's a lot of people looking inward after this COVID crisis, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. When we saw like overnight businesses that were booming, doing super successful businesses, something happened in the world that was out of their control and their business shut down. So I think people are looking at that, and they're looking at, politics, they're looking at what's going on in healthcare, they're looking at other situations, and they go, it might be time for me to hand this over to someone else and maybe go get a job, or maybe invest in the stock market or startups, or, try their new hand at the next business idea because their passions changed. Their lifestyle changed a little bit more. Swinging a hammer doesn't sound so fun anymore. Maybe a
Yeah.
desk job sounds good, right?
Yeah. I mean, certainly we've had a lot of entrepreneurs decide to continue working in the business because, again, they want to go home at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, whatever it is, and say, your problem, not mine. So the pandemic certainly changed a lot of people's attitudes for several days. Number one, if they did get sick and they got very sick, they're looking at, wow, life's short. Maybe I need to think. The other thing that you mentioned was the shutdowns. Now, we could argue for hours whether or not the shutdowns were right, wrong. I think everybody was kind of working in a black box. We certainly didn't know what the virus was like. We didn't know how many people would die. So, I think we overreacted in the beginning with these massive amounts of shutdowns. And a lot of times, the shutdowns in certain states were discriminatory on some levels. I mean, there were some industries that they'd shut down that they said, wait a second, you're letting people do this, and you're not letting, you're letting people go to the grocery store and walk around, but you're not letting people sit around my restaurant. And, and so it was rough. And I have a friend who owns a major catering company, and she was like, well, wait a second, they're letting people gather, in blah, 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 but they won't let people get married if they, want to get married. So it was tough. So it certainly, it as a business owner, you kind of looked at it. It's like, wow, there are some things that are out of my control that could happen to us, these black swan events that could put me out of business overnight. Now, the good news was, I think the government did a great job, like they did in 2009 and 2010, when they bailed out the economy. And this time around, they said, okay, wait a second. We bailed out the big banks and the big companies, in the economic downturn. This time, we're going to try to go right to the small business owners and give them things like PPP and EIDL loans. And for the vast majority, it worked. Yes, there's probably some fraud out there and things like that. But for the most part, it did a great job of preserving a lot of businesses.
Yeah. Now, with the fears of like the world falling apart or this or that, in your experience, like what is a good way to stay positive? Because as business owners, one of the fears is maybe the fear of the future. How can we, and how do you stay optimistic, towards the future when building businesses with tax uncertainty or business uncertainty or world uncertainty? What's your advice there?
My advice is people hate change. People hate change, right?
Yeah.
So there will be massive amount of force against change. And we see this, like, I'm part of my local town commission. I go to commission meetings, and there are people that don't want to rip down these dilapidated old buildings and put up brand new spanking buildings because we want it the way it used to be. And you could see that in the politics of today about people wanting to make, America like it was, or they want to preserve something. And so because people hate change so much, there's going to be a huge push there. I don't think any radical side, either side, is going to get their way. So what happens is radical one side and things kind of, the pendulum swings a little bit, radical other side, pendulum swings the other way. But at the end of the day, we're kind of muddling down the road. And if you look at the world, as far as major changes in the world, say over the last, let's not talk about World War I or World War II, these huge things. Let's look at, the last 50 years. For the most part, people screaming, the world's going to hell in a handbasket because in the 70s and 60s, because there's all these hippies and they're growing their hair long. Meanwhile, they're running the world right now, right? So, all that rock music in the 50s, it's going to be the death of all of us. I mean, in 80s, our rap is going to get, there's always those people, the millennials, now it's people who are woke. I mean, there's always this conversation that the world's going to hell in a handbasket, and it's not. So the good news is it's not, folks. Relax. There might be all these kind of noise out there, and certainly with the advent of cable news and 24-hour news and basically your ability to get the filtered news that you want, it certainly seems ramped up, but in reality, I don't think it is.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think for me personally, it's so hard for me to watch news nowadays because it seems like it's just constant bombardment of bad news, right? And
Well, so it sells, right? Negative
yeah,
news sells, and negative, and they've listen. We're going through some Facebook hearings, and they're talking about that. They understand that things that make people angry get more clicks. So, I think we as business owners and we as entrepreneurs need to stay that course and be listen, I was last night and I got into a political discussion with somebody, and we respectfully disagreed on some of it, and I'm very middle of the road, right? So he was a little bit more on one side than the other. And I said, listen, we could respectfully disagree. We certainly are, not ready to oust each other from the world because of our views. I think, when you get people in a room, and we see this in deals, right? So when people are on email and on the internet and they're shooting deals back, we're negotiating a deal, people could get pretty chippy and it could sound very nasty. And then we get in a room with all the attorneys for a closing, and that's becoming somewhat passe as well. But once we get people on a phone or a Zoom call, all of a sudden everybody's really nice. And because it's easy to hide behind your computer screen. Yeah. And so I again, I would tell people like myself, I don't listen to news anymore when I'm driving in my car. I listen to, believe it or not, an old iPod that I have plugged into my, a disposable iPod that I have like 2,000 songs on. It's music I like. So it puts me in a good mood, puts me in a good frame of mind. I think there's a lot of mindfulness out there in the world as far as meditating that you could do. And I think, the leaders, the entrepreneurs, the business owners, the people in academia, the people in nonprofits, we're going to win the day, and things are going to be good. So I advise everybody to have a really good outlook. I think in most areas of the world, of the United States, especially, we're going to see a renaissance of a lot of towns and population still growing, ability to work anywhere. So we're just hiring people for some positions at Transworld, and we, for the first time, said they don't have to live here. They could live somewhere else in the United States. And just think about like the towns, I don't want to pick on one, but the small towns in middle America where the factories have left and maybe the coal industry has left. And now those towns are getting a second shot because people in those towns could work anywhere.
Mhm.
They can make a really good salary. They can have a really good quality of life because they got room and they have low real estate costs. And then those downtowns can have these small little businesses pop up because those people now have money to spend. So I am really bullish on the future. I think it's a great time. Even, this is a seller's market, and prices, and we talked about fears of selling. You should have no fear of selling now. This is a good time, even if it goes up a little bit. Again, my 66-year-old guy who thinks it's going to go up a little bit. Yeah, but you're going to be 70 years old by the time you sell, and it goes up what, 10, 20%? I mean, enjoy your life. Sell now. So it's not a bad time to sell. So you shouldn't have that fear. And the buyers, even if they overpay a little, money's cheap. We could talk about that. And so they're not paying a lot to borrow it. And if they're making good money, who cares if they overpaid a little bit?
Yeah. Now, do you feel like, you've sold a lot of businesses, worked with a lot of people who had their exits. Do you feel that someone has their first exit, they go, oh man, maybe I want to do that again? Do you find a lot of people that go back into the game because they want to have exit number 2 because it was fun?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of that person, right? So I started a couple of businesses when I got out of college. My grade point average wasn't stellar. I was not going through the career department at Lehigh University, and them having companies line up for my my grade point average.
Yeah.
So I got out of school and said, hey, I'm going to maybe be an entrepreneur. And I started a few businesses, and I know you've started a few businesses. It's a difficult process. And so I bought a business with my cousins once upon a time. Our family pasta shop. It was called Cugino's, and we bought it for $45,000. We sold it for 65. And in that process, we made money in between. Not a lot of money. It was a lot. I learned so much from that business. But I said, wow, you can buy a business. Then if you do everything right and work hard, you could sell it for more and make money in the process and not have all those startup issues. Wow, that's a neat thing. That's a great process. So I was intrigued with that and decided to do it again. And I've, at Transworld, part of our growth path has been buying other business brokerages. So yeah, I think, we see a lot of serial entrepreneurs that they buy a business, they build a business, and they sell it. And they say, wow, that was a great process. Let's do it again.
Let's do it again. Now, when someone's building a business, like everybody, and I say this on other shows, is everyone's going to have an exit in their business, right? You're either going to do it voluntarily, right, and sell it and make some money, or if you live, if you work in it long enough, you're gonna you're gonna die, right? Everybody here dies so far. We have 100% mortality rate, so everybody exits their business, and I think a lot of people are afraid of the future, or some people are, and that the fear of selling, but it's going to happen. So I guess, leading up to that is when people are building their business, what do you think? And maybe they're not ready to sell. Maybe they're like me in my 40s, or not even 40 yet, but close. What's a good way for me to think of when should I sell as I'm building this business? When should how do I prepare myself for the future of that? Get myself ready for when it's a sell event, or if someone just shows up with a bucket of cash, like what should I start doing now in my late 30s, almost 40?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple questions you can ask yourself, right?
Yeah.
So who are you as far as an entrepreneur, right? So there are some entrepreneurs that are great at the early stage. They're great at bootstrapping it. They're great at, building sales. And then they're great at having a small team and being very entrepreneurial and not having to worry about kind of the politics of running a large office and HR issues and
Right.
they're not good at office politics, and they're not good at running a company. So there are those people that you have to ask yourself, what kind of, business owner are you? Are you a small business owner? Because there's nothing wrong with getting rid of a business when it's beyond your capabilities, that you just don't want to run it anymore, because now all of a sudden you have 50 employees, there's HR issues, you have to have trainings for discrimination, like like that's not the kind of company we are. We're the kind of company that, drinks beers on Friday nights and has fun playing pool in our ping pong table and a pool table in the company. And, eventually that goes away when you're building a big company. So you have to think to yourself, who's the best person to run this company if it's no longer you? And listen, I've had this question about myself. I've built Transworld for 25 years. It's like, is Andy Cagnetta the right guy to run this company for the next 25 years? Or the next 10 years or the next 5 years? Now, I do believe that be the case, say, listen, the next 5-10 years. But, I could almost guarantee 10 years from now that I may not be. And so that's kind of a question you could ask yourself of, two questions. Number one, what kind of entrepreneur are you? Again, I'm an entrepreneur, which if people say, what are you proud of? I'm proud that I was able to run a startup and effectively run a startup and know how to do it. And now I'm proud because I've transitioned into a CEO that can run a small, let's call it lower middle market company that's doing millions of dollars. So it's nice that my talents and my tolerance have changed. And then there's a risk tolerance, right? So some companies grow. If they're growing very fast, the entrepreneur has to make a decision at some point. Is they leverage their house, they went long on their credit cards, but the company's growing so fast that you just can't catch up. You're buying more inventory, you're opening more locations, you're hiring more employees, and it feels like this never ending, hey, I never get to take money out of it, and I constantly having to leverage myself to do it. And at some point that becomes unmanageable or even unsafe. And as an entrepreneur, you have to look at that and say, should I continue to take this risk? I did that. So I am not the 100% owned Transworld. I am the 76% owner of Transworld Florida. And I am, if I blend in my partner's company in the franchise, I am a 37.5% owner, if I did that math right, of Transworld, 38% owner of the franchise. And so why did I do that? Because at certain points when we raised capital and we had to replace that capital, I said, hey, I'm not going to borrow any more money from family. I'm not going to borrow money from my house. I want to spread out the risk a little bit, and I don't want to do this. Again, starting a franchise, I could have stopped and said, hey, I'm going to spend about $300,000 to $500,000 trying to launch a franchise. But I decided, hey, let's not do that. Let me leverage somebody else who already has that capacity. I don't have to invest in all those tools. So as an entrepreneur, you have to be thinking to yourself two things. Number one, am I the right person at this time for my company? And am I the right person in the next 5 years? And number two, can I handle the risk moving forward monetarily and, working capital wise?
Yeah, that's a great thought, because, as I'm building stuff out, I really like the small business world. I can never, and sometimes when you make plans, God laughs, right? But I don't think I would ever fit into a CEO of a publicly traded company role, right? The incredible amount of reporting, the incredible scrutiny. Like, I like small, nimble, like small teams. I have investments in, portfolios and such like that. But like, man, I love this. Like, I'm energized by this. So knowing my fit is so vital, right?
So I'm going to give you a compliment and say, you're not that guy, but I'm going to give you a compliment that's saying you're not that guy now.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think if you look at the CEOs of Twitter, and I think if you look at the CEOs of, I know a really great CEO of It's Sugar, Jeff, if you look at those companies, they started with a passion like you have and an energy, and they were able to bring those companies to public, kind of holdings and still stay in as the visionary and surround themselves with people that would deal with the things that they don't necessarily. So I think you will get there. I agree with you that you're not that guy now. And I don't think, 20 something years ago, when I started Transworld, I was capable of doing what I'm doing now. So I think you'll quote unquote, learn more, be more tolerant of those kind of things, or think a little bit differently along the way. But it's a journey, right? And it's timing, as you said.
Yeah. Super awesome, man. So with you mentioned, 5-10 years into the future, you're like, hey, maybe one day I'll replace myself. So when that happens, I know a guy named Andy who could help you sell the business if you're when it comes time. Okay, I'll introduce you guys.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's funny, sometimes doctors are the worst patients, right? So maybe I'm going to be a bad patient, but I don't think so. I think we think about it. We have a board of directors. We sit down and we think about our eventual exit. And we've had that conversation, and it's not something we're pursuing right now, but it's something that you're cognizant of, and even kind of a third thing. Forget the CEO. What about the business model? What's going to change in the business model? I think if you owned a taxi company or a limo company and you were thinking, hey, I've got it locked in. I've got these medallions. No one else is allowed to pick up at the airport. And I don't need to make changes to the way people pay. I don't need to make the taxis look any nicer. I don't need to have better customer service. And boom, they get run over by a thing that makes it easier to pay, that makes an easier, better customer experience, that gives, and then eventually the airports and everybody break because they just can't stop people from picking up at the airports, and your medallions are worth zero. I think that's somewhat coming back some way, but I think you have to look at your business model and say, hey, at some point my business model might not work. And certainly in the age of disruption, which you are a student of, you look at your business model and say, is this going to be around 10 years from now, 20 years from now?
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. So let's do this, Andy. I know we're going to have you guys on in the future and talk about more topics, but today we talked about, some of the fears that sellers have before making the decision to sell. Why don't we do a plug here? Like if someone's walking through and they're kind of afraid, they're sitting at that point going, should I sell? When should I sell? And they want to have a conversation with you. What's a good place for them to connect with you and maybe do a deal with you?
Yeah. I mean, I think you need a business broker as a friend, right?
Yeah.
So I think you need someone like myself or yourself that's kind of sitting alongside as a friend. Again, working with that advertising company, I've known her for many years, and she's like, I'm not ready to sell now, but let's just start talking. Let's meet, once a quarter. And I would advise every business owner to have a business broker. Listen, you have a CPA, or at least you should. You have a business attorney that you talk to. You have an insurance advisor. Have a business broker advisor, and just have someone that you could talk to about what the marketplace looks like. Every once in a while, first of all, every business owner should be in a networking group, and hopefully that networking group has a business broker where they feel comfortable to have conversations. And so if they want to get in touch with me, you could hit me up on LinkedIn. The nice thing is Andy Cagnetta is an easy name to find. There's not too many of us out there. And you certainly could email me at ac@tworld.com, or just go to tworld.com and, look us up. But, we're here for you. I mean, the fear, like, how do you get rid of fear? And we want to get rid of fear by education. We want to educate the sellers about their value, their current value, what their future value could be, their options moving forward. And then we could have a plan of when they want to sell. The average age of the baby boomer right now is 66 years old. At 66 to 67 years old, most people start taking that Social Security check, and they have to start taking distributions from their 401k. And now all of a sudden they're like, wait a second, I'm making money just existing. Do I really need to work every day anymore? And it's going to, it may hit you that fast. So it's time to start having conversations.
Cool. It's good to have a business broker in your relationships, because well, I'm gonna say this is when you have someone whose job it is to sell businesses all day long, looking at valuations and market trends, what's selling now, what's not selling now. Having someone in that is a good way to ask them. So if you know a business broker, you should ask them this: is what could I do today that will increase the value of my business so I could have a bigger multiplier, multiple when I go to sell this 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. You should always be asking a business broker, what's the current multiple? How do I increase the value of my business? What should I do to prepare it? What do I need to make sure that it's done right? So if that's the case, you guys listening into this show, you have those questions or want to ask one of those questions, reach out to our friend at Transworld, reach out to Andy, and just ask a few questions, build a relationship, and put someone like this in your tool belt, and do a deal with our guest. Till then, talk to you all on the next episode of the Deal Scout. See you guys.
Thanks.